Alright, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 102. And in this lecture, we're going to take a focused look at a certain element of American culture that develops in the early 19th century, in a period we've been examining for some time now. That is the development of a uniquely American form of theater, minstrel shows. And in this lecture, we'll talk about minstrel shows, their origins, their later consequence for American history. We still live in America where, unfortunately, people appear in blackface and perpetuate stereotypes about African Americans. There seems to always be a blackface controversy, even here in the 21st century. And in this lecture, you are going to be introduced to the origins of blackface, minstrelsy, and have a way of understanding contemporary controversies in America today and the haunting and troubling legacy of this American form of entertainment that develops in the early 19th century today. The first minstrel shows were performed in America in the 1830s. During this period of urbanization, where people are now living in cities. And as we talked about in our first lecture, that created a marketplace for images. That created a marketplace for pop culture. That was met by P.T. Barnum and his brand of entertainment. That was met by the penny press. And also by theater districts that developed in the 1830s alongside cities that catered to the entertainment needs of Americans now living in cities in an age of urbanization. So, again, this form of mass culture very much connected to the broader trends of this era. In those theater districts, the very first minstrel shows were performed in the 1830s, helping to establish the very first uniquely American form of popular theater. In theater districts, they performed popular plays, Shakespearean plays, folk tales that were rooted in European traditions. But also in the 1830s, in these theater districts, the first uniquely American form of storytelling and popular theater developed, the minstrel show. Now, minstrel shows have now become part of a global culture, and there are societies all over the world that still perform blackface minstrel shows. So today, minstrelsy is part of a global culture, and there are some very controversial, ugly, racist forms of minstrelsy that are still performed around the globe to this day. But it began here in the United States in the 1830s, out of this context of urbanization in these theater districts catering to the entertainment needs of people now living in cities, working in factories. Minstrel shows involved white actors performing in blackface. These were white actors who would smear their face with burnt cork mixed with oil and go on stage and present themselves as real, authentic representations of African Americans. So that's the definition of minstrelsy. Whites performing in blackface, performing skits, musical numbers, a variety program geared toward the entertainment needs of city-dwelling Americans in the antebellum period and throughout American history going forward. They represented themselves as real, authentic representations of African Americans. Now, of course, everyone in the audience was in on the ruse. Everyone in the audience was in on the manipulation. Everyone in the audience knew that those men on stage are not African Americans. They're not black. They're white men in blackface. But pop culture often traffics in falsehoods and lies. Pop culture often tells you this is untrue, this is false, this is a work. We call it reality TV, but we know there's nothing real about it. It's all manipulated, staged, and edited. Pro wrestling tells you this is a work. This is not an actual contest where the winner is in contest or dispute. We know TV shows, movies, or fantasy. But that doesn't stop us from being deeply invested in these stories. We suspend disbelief. We see it as real and true. We bring it inside ourselves in a way we talked about in our first lecture, how pop culture convinces you to be deeply invested in something that is so alien, separate from you, making the distant now close. So in minstrelsy, everyone in the audience knew those are not black people. But because these shows told the audience something they already believed and something they wanted to believe, people suspended disbelief and came to see minstrel shows as authentic representations of blackness. Now, when minstrel shows first began, they initially focused more on class than race. They're often rooted in critiques of the wealthy. And this is another continuity we'll see throughout the class, that pop culture, because it is pop culture, mass culture, appeals to the masses, often does initially have a class-based aspect to it, a class consciousness. When we talk about movies soon, we'll note that the very first movies in the silent era were geared towards working people, working class people. They were considered coarse and vulgar. Middle class, respectable Americans never went to see movies in the silent era because they were considered the province of the poor. And because of that, they tended to have a class consciousness where they represented the rich, bankers, landlords, as villainous. They represented figures of authority, the police, again, in an ignoble light. So pop culture, television, movies, usually these forms of mass culture we talk about in this class begin as geared towards a working class audience comprised of poor people. But over time, they become respectable and mainstream, like Hollywood, television, and other forms of entertainment. But in that initial stage, they often have this class consciousness where they critique the rich, where they celebrate the underdog, the little guy. And minstrel shows began that. But over time, they realized that the audience much prefers these stories that represent African Americans as inferior. I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why that minstrel shows came to be seen as real, authentic representations of blackness, where people would suspend disbelief and come to see the depictions, though obviously not made by African Americans, as demonstrative of an African American essence, was the fact that these performances told you something you already believed and wanted to believe. Minstrel shows represented African Americans as foolish, lazy, dangerous. They were built on existing racist prejudices. So they told you something you already believed or were inclined to believe, that blacks are lazy, unserious, irrational, libidinous, dangerous. But it also told you something that you benefited from, because it said all white people are superior to these black people who are inherently biologically inferior. It elevated the white audience. It elevated even the poorest American watching a minstrel show in New York City in the 1840s. You might be poor, you might have very little opportunity or education, but you're always inherently superior to these people. That's racism, and that's part of the appeal of minstrel shows. So over time, they became less committed to class consciousness and class critiques, which reminded you of your poverty, and instead focused on race, which elevated the standing of the audience above all people who were African American. It told you something you already believed, blacks are inherently inferior, and something you wanted to believe, that you, because you're white, are inherently superior. So it began as a class conscious form of entertainment, increasingly became a race-based form of entertainment. It employed racist stereotypes, many of which are still with us to this day. The dandy was a mainstay of minstrel shows. This was a white man in blackface who performed a character, a stock character, that almost all minstrel troupes had within its retinue. Part of the appeal of minstrel shows was formula. You knew what you're going to get time and time again, regardless of what troupe might be in town. Different troops traveled around the nation in an age of railroads and steamboats and cities and performed for an audience. But almost every troupe would have a stock cast of characters, including the dandy. This was a white man in blackface who would come on stage appearing to be well-dressed, refined, in a suit. He would begin to quote Shakespeare or some other soliloquy, speaking in very erudite, learned language. And then he would turn around and you would see a big hole in his pants and his underwear protruding. And the audience would guffaw and laugh. So the dandy was a comic foil. He was a figure there for laughter, for comedy, to laugh at. But there was also a racist message here, that when black people attempt to be refined, educated, they ultimately fail because of their biology and race. When the dandy turned around and you saw the hole in his pants, when he would use the wrong word, also part of the comedy of the dandy character, malaprops, using the wrong word. That was part of the comedy here. When the dandy used the wrong word, it was clear that he might try to be white, he might try to be educated, he might try to be refined, as whiteness was associated with education and refinement, but ultimately his race will reveal who he truly is, inferior, as he turned around and you saw the hole in his pants. The mammy was one of the few female characters in minstrel shows, and all female roles were performed by men. The performers in minstrel shows were white men in blackface. They performed all the roles. This was because theater in this time was considered coarse, vulgar, the domain of the working class, and no respectable woman would ever enter a theater. And that's why all the female roles were played by men. The mammy was a black female slave who was represented as a woman, a black woman who loved to cook and clean for whites. Her whole identity focused on her role as a servant. She had no children of her own. She cared for your children. She had no home of her own. She took care of your house. So her entire identity was in relation to her function and role for whites, providing comfort and care to whites in a joyous way, as this white actor performed in blackface with a big smile on his face, more than thrilled to cook and clean for whites. So the mammy was one of the few female characters performed by white men, and it represented certain stereotypes, racism regarding black women, that their whole identity and role was to care for whites, to make them more comfortable, that they enjoyed being enslaved, that this was a pleasure for them, that they had no identity other than being a servant. The mammy image has, like so many of these stereotypes, lived on. This is the image of Aunt Jemima. You'll read about Disneyland in the Eric Avila book, and how when Disneyland opened in 1955, when America was in the thickets, the throes of the modern civil rights movement, the year that Rosa Parks will be arrested, in Disneyland 1955, there's a restaurant called Aunt Jemima's Pancake Kitchen. The menu for that restaurant urged those who went to Disneyland in 1955 to come and, quote, this was the language for the menu, relive the days of the Old South. You know, those good old days of slavery. So Aunt Jemima, a character who becomes a mainstay of American consumer and popular culture in the 20th century, who is there as part of this landmark pop culture event, the opening of Disneyland in July of 1955, in a restaurant that urged you to come by and relive the days of the Old South, is an image of black womanhood as a servant, as a woman who is there to comfort and care for you, make pancakes for you. When The Help, that book and film, came out some years ago, and the film was nominated for a number of Academy Awards, it was celebrated as a film that centered on black women. And the actresses in that film received a lot of nominations for Academy Awards. But others decried that film because it was yet another example of how the only time that black women are represented in pop culture is as maids and domestics. So the mammy image really lives on in many of the controversies in pop culture in the 21st century. The buck was an image of black manhood, performed again by a white man in blackface. The buck was the unrepentant, angry, violent slave who had to be controlled and disciplined. He was a character in the minstrel show that you booed at, jeered at, that stoked the fires of racism and fear of black men in particular. The buck is an important image in relation to what we're reading about early in this class, the Jack Johnson book, and how he was often represented as this threatening menace, particularly in regards to sexuality, as he dated and married white women. The image of the violent black man, the libidinous black man, the sexual black man who wants to rape or have sex with your white daughter, that's the buck character, who was not there for laughs, but for, again, antagonizing the audience, getting jeers, but again, also establishing enduring stereotypes that will haunt Jack Johnson and images of black manhood to this day. The Sambo was the image of a black slave who was carefree, happy, and this represents slavery as benign. Slaves like to be slaves, It was one of the many ways in which minstrel shows stripped slavery of its terrorism and violence, representing the happy-go-lucky slave. It also represented black men as lazy. The Sambo was always looking to get out of work. He was another comic character who you laughed at. He was driven by his immediate urges for drink and sex and food, so irrational, unserious, motivated simply by the pursuit of pleasure. And again, you see that a lot in stereotypes of black men to this day, certainly in the Jack Johnson book, how he was represented as hedonistic. And therefore, black men had to be controlled and disciplined. So the Sambo communicated a lot of the same racist ideas as the buck, that black men are to be feared or seen as potentially dangerous, but did so in a comic way that represented slavery as benign, this happy, contented slave dancing. So overall, minstrel shows communicated these racist stereotypes, many of which, of course, existed for centuries prior to minstrel shows. It told you something you already believed, but then advanced those in new ways, in this new form of mass entertainment that has had such a huge influence in mass culture going forward to this very day. Representing blacks as stupid, as obsessed with pleasure, as libidinous, as dangerous, as violent, as solely existing for the role they play for white society. Many of the minstrel show troupes were named for places in Africa. The Congo Players, very popular minstrel show troupe in the early 19th century. Reference to the Congo River, and the Dahomey Players, also a very popular one. Reference to a kingdom in West Africa where many enslaved people were brought from during the Atlantic slave trade. And so this emphasis on their Africanness was a way of, again, marking them as outside the nation, not one of us, not Americans, alien, exotic, so that you saw them, again, not as human beings, your fellow Americans, but as aberrant, strange, and exotic. Also, minstrel shows played a very pernicious role in another way that we can still see to this day in many of our misunderstandings of the African American experience. Not only did it represent them as alien from America, emphasizing their Africanness, not only did it represent them as dangerous, violent, irrational, clumsy, lazy, ignorant. It also represented slavery, the institution of slavery, in a way devoid of its violence and terrorism. Happy, contented slaves singing in the fields. Almost every minstrel show ended with a big ensemble number, the whole cast performing a musical number that sent the audience home happy. But in doing so, it tended to represent slavery again in a way that stripped it of its inherent violence and terrorism. And that's part of a long tradition in America of representing slavery in such a fashion. There's a great deal of evidence and documentation, writing by historians, examining how textbooks throughout American history have represented slavery in a way that stripped it of its real violence and terrorism and dehumanization. Gone with the Wind, first a Pulitzer Prize novel in 1936, then later a landmark film, first released in 1939, but still re-released through the 1980s in an era before home video. One of the most popular, highest grossing films of all time, represented slavery as benign. The antebellum South is this sort of romantic wonderland of hoop skirts and gentlemen. And that film has had a huge influence on how Americans misunderstand slavery. Minstrel shows are part of that tradition of representing slavery in this very benign way, and it remains a struggle to this day to strip Americans of that misconception and see slavery for what it was: violent, dehumanizing, and terroristic. Minstrel shows began in the 1830s. They enjoyed their greatest popularity in the mid-19th century, when these trends of urbanization, industrialization are at their height. In that period, this form of entertainment became very, very prevalent, very, very popular. It's in this period that minstrel shows are largely stripped of any class consciousness and focus exclusively on race. So, as America fully industrialized, urbanized in the mid-1800s, these minstrel shows became more and more popular. Well-known troops would crisscross the nation in an age of steamboats and railroads and cities performing. While minstrel shows are becoming so popular, the nation is rocked by a massive debate about slavery that eventually will lead to the Civil War of the 1860s. While that debate is raging, there's another representation of blackness in American society, developing right alongside contemporaneously with minstrel shows, the abolitionist movement. 1830s would mark the origins of minstrel shows, which we've now described, representing blacks as violent, libidinous, inherently inferior, and slavery as benign and devoid of violence. But also in 1830s, for the first time, you'd have abolitionist newspapers published, like The Liberator, which told the truth of slavery as violent, dehumanizing, in an effort to try to persuade Americans to support abolishing slavery. Abolitionist newspapers come out of the trends we talked about in the first lecture, the penny press, steam press, mass circulation of newspapers, a more contagious society where ideas can spread and influence and infect. In the 1830s, you had the first copies of The Liberator and other abolitionist newspapers, where they were there to raise alarm about slavery, where often the accounts of real African Americans, not whites and blackface, were published. In abolitionist newspapers, escaped slaves would often publish their accounts, Frederick Douglass and others, in an effort to try to persuade white readers to support the end of slavery. So in the 1830s, you have the origins of two very different representations of blackness. Minstrel shows, which trafficked in racism, stereotypes, represented slavery as benign, and the abolitionist movement, which was an indictment of slavery, a call for a movement against slavery that offered arguably the very first opportunity in American history for blacks to be in control of their representation, representing themselves in the accounts that they penned and wrote in an effort to, again, tell the truth of slavery. But far more Americans go to see a minstrel show than ever read an abolitionist newspaper. Abolitionism was always a small, passionate, but small movement. Most Northerners aren't abolitionists, even through the Civil War. They didn't support ending slavery. They didn't support the effort to create a new America, freedom and equality for all. And partly because they believed in the racist stereotypes that minstrel shows trafficked in. So the point we made in our first lecture, the point we returned to throughout this class, is that mass culture has an influence. It shapes as well as reveals an age because it's mass culture, because it's consumed by a large swath of the population. And in comparing these two forms of representation of blackness, abolitionism and minstrel shows, so very different, it's minstrel shows that ultimately has the greater influence because it is consumed by the masses. 1840s, 1850s, as the country is rocked by the debate regarding slavery that eventually will lead to a civil war, you get more and more popularity of minstrel shows. Now, minstrel shows were popular almost exclusively in the North. You might think, well, Southerners love these, right? Well, no. Very few minstrel shows are ever performed in the antebellum South. Because, as we've talked about, minstrel shows come out of the city. They come out of the urban nightlife and culture that develops in this period. There are no big cities in the South prior to the Civil War. The South is a domain of slavery. It is a domain largely untouched by urbanization, industrialization, the transportation revolution. Prior to the Civil War, those developments aren't sweeping through the South like they are in the North. So Northerners are going to see minstrel shows, not Southerners, and becoming convinced by the racist representations that are such a counter to the small group of people who are reading abolitionist newspapers. So here's another good example of how pop culture takes the distant and makes it close. In northern states, in northern cities, where slavery had ended, as northern states industrialize, urbanize, they end slavery. As these northern states transition to an industrial economy, slavery begins to die out in northern states. And that means that the only interaction that northerners have with slavery is through minstrel shows. It takes that institution from the South and brings it into the mental, cultural orbit of Northerners living in cities, working in factories. And these performances by white men in blackface, trafficking in racism and racist stereotypes, become the chief way of whites in the North of seeing slavery, of quote-unquote knowing slavery. They don't interact with slavery because, oh, that's a Southern thing. We here in the North ended that. We're now a domain of cities, factories, railroads. And so this institution from the South is coming to the North through a form of pop culture, taking the distant and making it close, but in doing so, representing it in this very distorted way, as benign, as carefree, as devoid of violence, and also trafficking in racist stereotypes, confirming what white Northerners already believe, but also elevating their status by telling them that all blacks are inherently inferior. Here is a poster for one of the very popular minstrel show troupes of the antebellum period. This one headed by Dan Emmett, who was a pioneer in minstrel shows, helped create many of the characters that eventually become mainstays of minstrel shows. Dan Emmett was one of the key pioneers of minstrel shows, and he was the leader of a group called the Virginia Minstrels. And I offer this to you here for two reasons. One, there's very little in terms of visual evidence from minstrel shows prior to the Civil War in the antebellum period. A few photographs, as photography was still a new technology, expensive, rare, dangerous. Some also we have illustrations. And here's a good example of how minstrel shows were marketed, what you might see as a poster advertising that Dan Emmett, the famous Dan Emmett, and his minstrels were in town. Of course, the other reason why I offer this to you is that it's a good example of how minstrel shows so baldly, openly trafficked in racism. You could see that in these images here that to us are disgusting and revolting, rightfully so, but are very demonstrative of what you would expect to see. So we don't have, visual footage of minstrel shows performed in the 1840s, 1850s. There are a few photographs, certainly no motion pictures in this period. What we do have are these other forms of visual expression, like posters, that give us a good indication of what people saw on stage in this period. The impact of minstrel shows is manifold. As we've already said, it helped to further racist stereotypes, solidify them, express them in a mass format that help us understand why these stereotypes persist to this day. It represented slavery in a way that led to misunderstandings and misconceptions that also prevail to this day. But also, another impact of minstrel shows was in formula, in the way in which the entertainment was organized. And that, too, has lived on to this day, even as minstrel shows become rightfully targeted and end as racist. The formula of entertainment that it offered lives on to this day in variety shows, in Saturday Night Live, and America's Got Talent, because minstrel shows had this formula for entertainment that involved moving quickly from one performance to another in a way that, again, we could see in our pop culture to this day. So another impact of minstrel shows was in our way of thinking about entertainment, of organizing entertainment, and a certain formula for doing so. Every minstrel show began with a first act where the entire troupe would be on stage together and they'd perform a big musical number. Now, this was a necessity. As I mentioned earlier, theaters in this period were considered coarse and vulgar, not places for respectable people to go, the domain of the working class, the poor people living in cities working in factories. And because of that, if the performance was bad, if it did not entertain the audience who plunked down their hard-earned pennies for admission, they would let you know. They would boo you. They would chase you from the stage. They'd pelt you with rotten tomatoes. So you had to win them over quickly. You had to convince them. And you did that with a big opening number. And then in the second part of the performance, you'd go from one individual act to another. The mammy, the dandy, they'd come out. They'd perform their skits, their musical numbers. They'd win over the audience in their individual talents. And then you had that last final act where once again the entire ensemble was together and they did a comedy skit or a big musical number, usually set on a plantation, again representing slavery in the way we talked about earlier. So there's a certain formula to minstrel shows, Also, they almost all had an interlocutor, an MC, another white man in blackface, who wouldn't perform on stage but would be down in the pit, down in the audience, and be sort of a go-between between the people on stage and the audience. Now, part of the role of the interlocutor was to be the sort of MC, to introduce the different transitions and changes, and to cue the audience to boo when they were supposed to boo, cheer when they were supposed to cheer. But another role of the interlocutor was sort of, again, crowd control, to stem perhaps a surge of sorts where the audience would express its displeasure. The interlocutor was right there, down in the audience, and could anticipate and perhaps quell any sort of backlash in that way. But what this did was it established the role that we still see today in many forms of mass culture, the MC, the host, the guy who introduces the different acts coming back and forth across the stage. There were, again, stock characters. Again, this is part of the formula. Pop culture often traffics in formula. It gives you the same story over and over again, like a sitcom today, like a reality show today. You don't have to see every episode of Judge Judy to understand the premise immediately, because you've seen it before. Pop culture traffics in formula. And minstrel shows had a stock formula of presenting the entertainment, and then many stock characters, like the Jim Crow character, which was pioneered by Thomas Rice, like Dan Emmett, a key pioneer of minstrel shows. And this was a variation of the Sambo, the buffoon, the fool, the comic foil, the African American who was lazy, carefree, driven by his immediate urges. And he created this character known as Jim Crow. Now, later on, that term Jim Crow becomes a term that historians use for describing what happened in America for 100 years after slavery. Jim Crow America. You've probably heard that term before, referring to the 100-year period from the end of the Civil War in 1865 through the modern civil rights movements of the 1960s, where you had segregation, discrimination, lynchings, all that defined that 100-year period that we call Jim Crow America. Now, when I teach a U.S. history class and I use that term, students will sometimes raise their hand and say, who is this guy Jim Crow? Was there a guy named Jim Crow? And the answer is very revealing, because no, there wasn't an actual human being named Jim Crow. Instead, that term that we historians use to describe that period of segregation, discrimination in American life comes from minstrel shows, from a representation of blackness by whites that often justified discrimination, racism, prejudice, racialized violence, by representing African Americans in these racist stereotypes. Now, Thomas Rice always claimed that he based his Jim Crow character on an actual slave. He said, I went to the South, I saw this African American slave walking down the road with a sort of shuffle to his walk, and I used that as the basis for my character. So minstrel shows, again, were based on a lie. They were based on a manipulation. White men in blackface represented themselves as real, authentic representations of blackness. The audience was in on the ruse. The audience knew those are not white men on stage. But because minstrel shows told you something you wanted to believe, benefited from white supremacy, white superiority, people believed what they were seeing as real, authentic representations of blackness. And also, minstrel shows worked to convince you of that by often making claims of authenticity despite the obvious fraud and manipulation. And Rice did that by saying, well, my character, though it's again performed by me, a white man, is real and authentic because I based it on a real African American. I mentioned earlier the Mammy character as one of the stock, formulaic, repeated characters that almost every minstrel show troupe offered because pop culture relies on formula. Another very common representation of black female image was the mulatto character. This was also a mainstay of minstrel shows. Now, the term mulatto is offensive to our ears. Today, we would use the term like biracial instead to refer to someone who is of mixed background, who might be half white, half black. So today we use the term biracial, and the term mulatto to us sounds very offensive, and rightfully so. But in the 19th century, they didn't use the term biracial. They used that term mulatto to refer to someone who was half black and half white. Now, this character was almost always represented as female, but again, performed by a white man. In a moment, we'll look at a picture from a mulatto character in a minstrel show of the late 19th century when photography became more prevalent, and you'll clearly see that though the character was a biracial woman, it's performed by a white man. Now, the mulatto character was, again, almost always a female character, biracial, and she was represented as a tragic figure. Many of the minstrel shows, again, in order to offer an entire evening of entertainment, move quickly from comedy to music to pathos and tragedy, and then back to comedy and music. And so the mulatto character was the part of the story that was often dramatic, dripping with pathos and tragedy. She was tragic because she would never know love. As part of the mulatto skit, she would be sought by suitors who wanted to win her hand in marriage. And a white man may come to see her, but then ultimately reject her because she was half black. And then a black suitor would come and court her, but then reject her because she was half white. So she was destined to be alone, miserable. There's all this racism and sexism wrapped together in this character that, her whole identity was a function of whether or not she would ever get married. But she would never get married because she was rejected by both whites and blacks. And the racist message here was, well, if these two worlds intersect, if they meet, if blacks and whites have sex and make children who are biracial, those people will be miserable. So it was another emphasis on racism, racial purity, keeping blacks and whites separate in that way. Other stock characters, the dandy, which we talked about earlier, a variation of the dandy was known as the Zip Coon. Again, the name is so offensive to us, but very revealing of the racism that prevailed in minstrel shows. The Zip Coon was a variation of the dandy, again, black man, again represented by whites and blackface, who sought to be educated, refined, but eventually was revealed to be a fool and an idiot with his holy clothing and his malaprops. And so the audience could look down on him. The audience could elevate their own standing, even though they might be poor, penniless, urban workers eking out a desperate living in New York City in the 1850s. They could still look down on any black person based on the racial supremacy that such a character offered. So there was this formula of telling the story, these different acts, the MC, the interlocutor, and there was this formula of stereotypes, characters that every minstrel show troupe would have in its retinue. Again, pop culture relies on formula. You get the same thing over and over again. And minstrel shows have this common formula. But the formula would live on even after minstrel shows eventually die out in things like the variety show, the talent show, Saturday Night Live, where you have a host, a musical guest, and a series of skits. So another one of the lasting influences of the minstrel show was in its formula of storytelling. One last common character that appeared in minstrel shows after the Civil War, necessarily so. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. It means that if the North prevails, it will end slavery. Another one of the consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation was that it allowed, for the first time, black men to enlist in the U.S. Army. Black men had served in support capacities prior to the Emancipation Proclamation in service to the Union Army, but they couldn't actually be soldiers until the Emancipation Proclamation. And over the course of the Civil War, over 100,000 African Americans will serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. They were often the bravest soldiers of all because they were often pushed out first early in the battle, facing the Confederate Army when the Confederate Army had its greatest power, best equipped. So this is a way of saving white lives by making black soldiers march out first, and that's good reason to see black soldiers as the most brave of all. If captured, sometimes they were executed. You have the Fort Pillow Massacre, which occurred during the Civil War, where a white Confederate officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who will later go on to form one of the very first chapters of the Ku Klux Klan after the war, ordered black soldiers who had surrendered to be summarily executed. So black soldiers were often the most brave of all. They faced deprivation, racism. They were often sent out first against the Southern Army when it was best equipped. They were denied POW status if they surrendered and mistreated, sometimes killed. But in minstrel shows, the black soldier after the Civil War is represented as a coward who would throw down his rifle and run at the first shot. And of course, this was comic foil, comic fodder. The audience could laugh at the black soldier. It reinforced notions of black manhood as weak and not brave, racism often involves this contradictory elasticity where black men are simultaneously represented as violent and dangerous and then also as cowards. And you could see that in many representations of black men to this day. And so after the Civil War, a new character entered the minstrel show performances and became a mainstay of minstrel shows. The cowardly black soldier, again, performed by a white man in blackface. And this is pernicious for a couple of reasons. One, it's so contrary to the history of the Civil War. Where, as I said earlier, black soldiers were the bravest of all. They weren't cowards. They fought for their freedom. They fought for the freedom of millions like them. They were again subject to racism, deprivation, and yet they soldiered on. But it's also, of course, pernicious because after the Civil War, there's very little recognition of the service that black men performed in the Civil War. When in 1989, the film Glory came out, film critics who reviewed that film for major publications like the New York Times, Time Magazine, conceded in their reviews, hey, I never knew this. I never knew that black soldiers had fought in the Civil War, because for more than a century we covered up this history. We have monuments in this country to Confederate generals, Confederate soldiers, traitors to this nation. That's what the Confederate soldier was. He was a traitor. He took up arms against the U.S. government. He fought against the U.S. government in order to preserve and extend slavery. They get monuments. The only recognition of the brave, noble, patriotic service of black soldiers was in minstrel shows where they're represented as cowards, until more recent efforts like you see that in Glory to remind us of a past that we lost because whites were in charge of representing blacks, often in this way as cowards and buffoons. More visual evidence for us here. On the left here is a playbill representation of that famous Thomas Rice character, Jim Crow. And again, you could see in this illustration, though it's just an illustration, a bit of the characteristics of how Rice would perform this very ugly stereotype of black men. You could see the hole in the shoe and the patchwork element of their clothing. On the right, here is a photograph, not an illustration, a photograph from a minstrel show in the late 19th century. And this represents the tragic mulatto character. On the left is the mulatto character, who again was represented in the storyline as biracial. Here she is being courted by a black suitor who eventually will reject her, deny her love and marriage. And that's the way in which the mulatto wench, as she was often referred to, was represented as this tragic character, again with a racist message behind that. These are two worlds that should never intersect, never should meet. You could see clearly the ways in which these female characters are performed by white men. That's clearly a man in that character. Another thing that's interesting about the mulatto character, though, in the storyline she was biracial, the blackface, the makeup used, was often the same as the makeup used for black characters. So there's no effort to make her lighter in skin, demonstrative of what many historians call the one-drop rule. The idea that if you have one drop of black blood, you're 100% black. And so though this character was half black, she was represented in the same way as the black characters. But gives you a good visual window into what minstrel shows look like in the late 19th century and a little bit more about this mulatto character. Now, minstrel shows continued to be performed in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. After the Civil War, you might imagine, well, these are going to be seen as, ignominious, regrettable, and they would die out. But not the case. Minstrel shows continued to be performed well into the late 19th and early 20th century. But eventually minstrel shows began to decline as popular theater, not because they were seen as racist and troubling and something to end, but simply because they were outcompeted by a new form of popular entertainment, vaudeville. Vaudeville became the prevailing form of popular theater in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as America fully industrialized, urbanized, in theater districts that now span the country, as most Americans by 1900 live in cities, work in factories, as industrialization became the rule. In the theater districts of that age, vaudeville became the most popular. Now, vaudeville was a form of entertainment that, again, was rooted in minstrel show traditions in the formula. because it offered this quick cut from one performer to another, where you'd have comedy, music, sometimes tragedy, all mixed together. But because it wasn't rooted in slavery, blackface, it was more expansive in that way. It could offer different forms of entertainment. You had a magician, a juggler, an animal act, a comedian. Vaudeville was a world of entertainment under one roof. You paid your admission, you went in, you saw all these different forms of entertainment, and they were liberated from the confines of minstrel shows, which had to focus necessarily on African Americans, or at least white depictions of African Americans and slavery. So vaudeville really triumphed because it offered a more expansive form of entertainment. It was liberated from the confines of minstrel shows. You could see a musical number, a magician, a juggler. Some of the very first opportunities to see motion pictures in America before you had set theaters that exclusively showed movies was in a vaudeville performance, where they would have the comedian come out, the magician come out, the juggler come out, and then they would roll out this big contraption known as a kinetoscope. And you'd watch a short 10-minute film, and then they'd go back to the live performances. So it was all these different forms of entertainment together. And it proved to be more popular minstrel shows. It was new. It was, again, expansive. It offered different forms of entertainment. Many white actors who had thrived in minstrel shows were hired by vaudeville troupes, and so they stole the best actors away, and that's what eventually leads to the decline of minstrelsy. Now, it's revealing that what ended minstrel shows wasn't a change in attitudes. It wasn't America seeing minstrel shows as racist and pernicious and wanting to end them. As you read about in the Jack Johnson book, in the late 19th, early 20th century, in the age of vaudeville, Jack Johnson performed in vaudeville. It was one of the many things he did when he didn't fight. In that era, as revealed in the career and life of Jack Johnson, America was very racist. So it's not as if we are getting woke in this period. It's not as if minstrel shows end because we changed racist attitudes. It's simply something else came along that was more popular, that fit with the entertainment needs of that period. So it's revealing that what led to the decline of minstrel shows was not a change in attitudes, declining racism. In fact, America was just as racist as it ever was in that period. It was simply a different form of entertainment. But what replaces minstrel shows, vaudeville, was rooted in minstrel shows. It may not involve whites and blackface, but that formula of quick cuts, movements from one form of entertainment to another was rooted in what minstrel shows helped pioneer. Yet there are still some minstrel show troupes working in the early 20th century, and interestingly, this is one of the many fascinating elements of minstrel shows, when so many white actors and performers and musicians were first being drawn to vaudeville, and then later by the 1910s and 1920s to movies. Another thing that helps end minstrel shows, motion pictures. And so many great musicians and entertainers and comedians were now working in Hollywood. When this begins, there's a great scramble by minstrel shows to have entertainment, to have performers. And you get African Americans now performing in minstrel shows in the early 20th century. Obviously, they weren't performing in blackface, though sometimes they did. Sometimes you had black actors smear their face with burnt cork or grease paint to make them even darker, to really appeal to the racist elements of minstrel shows. But some of them, of course, didn't wear blackface. They didn't need to. They were performing in minstrel shows. Now, that really boggles the mind in many ways, to think of a black actor going on stage and performing in this tradition. They were expected to play the role of dandy, Zip Coons, mammies, and others. So here were these black men who were performing in a way that worked against their freedom, worked against their equality, worked against civil rights by trafficking in such racism. The reason why so many African Americans worked in minstrel shows was their only way into show business. They couldn't get hired by Hollywood. They couldn't get a recording contract with RCA. The only way to get started as actors and musicians was often in minstrel shows, where they had to go daily, nightly, on stage and traffic in these stereotypes and racist images that worked against their own civil rights, freedom, equality. Later on, many of them did work in Hollywood, later even in television, when television premiered in the 1950s, or were able to win recording contracts and produce what were known as race records by recording companies that geared records towards African American consumers. But they only had that chance later to be in charge of their image by first, in many ways, being forced to be degraded, as minstrel shows were still performed well into the early 20th century, now sometimes with black performers. Though this phenomenon of live performances of minstrel shows eventually dies and ends by the early 20th century. There are no minstrel shows being performed in that way in the mid-20th century. Blackface doesn't end, as we've had some very recent reminders. The point I made at the beginning of this lecture. What we're talking about here is not just a form of mass culture that developed in the 19th century. We're in many ways talking about a form of mass culture that prevails to this day. We have many it seems like every few months there's another blackface scandal in 2019, 2020. Right? The governor of Virginia, a recent example of this. So minstrel shows might end, but blackface doesn't. Whites performing as African Americans in blackface. It continued through the 20th and now in the 21st century, and often was visible in some of the great landmark changes in popular culture in the 20th century. Some of the very first Hollywood movies featured blackface. Some of the most landmark Hollywood features featured blackface. The Jazz Singer, 1927, the first talkie, the first film with sound, involved the lead role, Al Jolson, performing throughout the film in blackface. So you have this landmark film, 1927, the talkie, the very first film with sound that's deeply connected to the pop culture of the previous century, minstrel shows. There are so many cartoons that you cannot show on the Cartoon Network or other broadcasts today, Bugs Bunny and others, that are so racist because they featured forms of blackface. Mickey Mouse is a minstrel show character. There's a black figure with white gloves. So many minstrel show performers had white gloves as a way of attracting the attention of the audience. Dumbo with the black crows in that movie. So forms of blackface and minstrelsy live on in cinema and other forms of mass culture in the 20th century. For a long time, the best-selling song of the 20th century was White Christmas, that famous song performed by Bing Crosby, which became, until Thriller and some other releases of the late 20th century, the best-selling single of the 20th century. That song was first performed in a movie called Holiday Inn in the 1940s that featured Judy Garland, yes, Dorothy Gale, in blackface. So minstrel shows end, but blackface doesn't. And of course, again, we've had so many recent examples of that. Later in the class, in a lecture coming soon, I know, bated breath, you just can't wait, right? We'll talk about Amos and Andy, which was first a radio program and then later a TV show. Amos and Andy, the radio program, was pioneered by two white men who began their career in minstrel shows. It became the most popular radio program of the 20s and 30s, a daily radio broadcast that featured white men in, we might say, black voice. And then eventually it became a TV show in the 1950s. So it's another good example of how minstrel shows might end, but blackface and the traditions of minstrelsy live on in new popular media of the 20th century: radio, film, television. I mentioned earlier, there are so many cartoons from this period, not just racist depictions of African Americans, but Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, as part of, again, the new medium of cinema, as cartoons were, before television, featured in motion pictures. So again, good evidence of the lasting influence of minstrelsy. And then again, if you separate the racial elements here, and it's hard to do that because it's, of course, the central element of minstrelsy and also key to its persistence. But even if you put aside the racial elements, I've said throughout this lecture that the form of storytelling, the formula of minstrel shows, lives on, even without blackface and racism. In the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s, the most popular TV shows in America were variety shows: Ed Sullivan, Dinah Shore, Carol Burnett. And a variety show, as its name indicates, offered a variety of different forms of entertainment in one program. So you'd have music, comedy, magicians. It's basically vaudeville broadcast. But that formula of storytelling of different acts, of different individual characters, of moving quickly from one form of entertainment to another, all comes from minstrel shows. And then you have Saturday Night Live in the 70s and 80s, same thing, right? And then today, all of these shows like America's Got Talent, variety shows of today, they're all based on that same formula. So even if you separate the racist elements of minstrel shows, which live on in the 20th and 21st century, there's a way in which that form of storytelling lives on in those ways. So many key aspects of American culture deeply connected to minstrel shows. Stephen Foster is considered the father of the American songbook. Though he died penniless and obscurity in the late 19th century, the songs he wrote have lived on as songs that we learn as part of our folk culture, American culture, what are often identified as Americana. These are the songs you learn in grade school. These are the first songs you perform in music class on your recorder, Oh Susanna, Camp Down Races. Well, Stephen Foster wrote many of those songs for minstrel shows. He began his career writing for minstrel shows. American presidents of the 19th century went and watched minstrel shows, from John Tyler to James K. Polk, Millard Fillmore, even Abraham Lincoln, who loved theater. He dies in a theater, of course. His one indulgence, he loved coarse, vulgar entertainment. He had sort of a dirty sensibility in many ways. He liked dirty jokes. It's not often what you think about the great emancipator Lincoln, but he enjoyed this form of entertainment, and he watched popular theater. He was killed in a theater or comedy. He was laughing hysterically when John Wilkes Booth, the white supremacist and pro-slavery sympathizer, killed Lincoln for what Lincoln had done. But as part of his experience prior to that moment in the theater where he's killed, he went to many minstrel shows. So the guy who's associated with ending slavery was himself a devotee of minstrel shows. Another one of the ways in which minstrel shows are so vital to bigger, larger stories in American history and American culture is that's yet another example of a trend we'll talk a lot about in lectures to come, we'll read about, this phenomenon of whites appropriating black culture. Minstrel shows are about whites performing as blacks, representing themselves as real representations of blackness, taking control of representation of blackness. Well, that lives on well beyond minstrel shows. That's the story of jazz. Jazz began as an idiom of music where African Americans combined elements of European music with African music traditions, and they created this very uniquely American form of music, jazz. But by the 1930s, 1940s, Glenn Miller and others, Perry Como, Frank Sinatra, are taking that form of music that originated with African Americans and using it to become rich and famous. Rock and roll, hip hop, just so many examples of this phenomenon that spans American history and American culture, where whites take what they imagine black culture to be and use it for their own interest and advancement. In the 1950s, the American writer, novelist Norman Mailer wrote an essay called The White Negro, where in the 1950s, he was describing this process by which whites were this is the term he uses, hipsters. It's so revealing, again, in terms of how this lives on. The hipsters he described in the 1950s in this essay, The White Negro, were whites who in the 50s would go to jazz clubs, and they would adopt black slang, peppering their language with terms that they borrowed from African Americans, and going to jazz, speaking in this way, countercultural types who were rejecting uptight 1950s American culture. So in the 1950s, he was just crying this white Negro he described. And it's just one of many examples throughout our history of this process by which whites want to appropriate black culture and attach to them this power, this aura, this coolness that Mailer and others have described. In that essay, Mailer says, of the white Negro, they want all of the thunder, that's the term he uses, of black culture, meaning all that power, that coolness, that aura, and none of the pain. Meaning they want to be black without the racism, prejudice, disenfranchisement, all that goes with black skin. They want all the thunder with none of the pain. Well, that has a long history that begins in many ways with minstrel shows. Now, not all minstrel shows were dedicated to representing blacks as menacing and ignorant and threatening. Some of them often represented African Americans in a more sympathetic light. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the abolitionist novel that was first published in 1852 and ultimately by 1854 is in 1 million different copies in print and proving to be very influential, was turned into a stage play. And in the stage play of Uncle Tom's Cabin, most of the actors were white in blackface, and they tended to represent slavery more in line with the abolitionist movement as something cruel and barbaric. And so very few, but some minstrel shows represented African Americans in a more humane way. There's the whole complexity of, again, how blacks performed in minstrel shows. How do we make sense of that? It's one of the many ways in which pop culture is this complicated tangle, this mess of sorts. Are we inclined to see them as betrayers of their race, as dupes and fools who openly trafficked in racism? Or a more sympathetic reading could see that, again, as them seeking some opportunity to get started in show business in a racist America that would not grant opportunity to black actors and musicians and comedians, so they had to first cut their teeth in minstrel shows before they got later opportunities. Not only was Uncle Tom's Cabin turned into a minstrel show, but Nat Turner's Rebellion was also dramatized in minstrel shows. Nat Turner was a slave who led the most influential slave rebellion in American history in Virginia in 1831. Of course, he was vilified by Southerners, represented as the dangerous, menacing, violent black man. But abolitionists saw him as a hero who sought to liberate his people. And there were some minstrel show performances that represented Nat Turner in that fashion, in a heroic way. In 1839, there's a slave rebellion aboard a Spanish ship known as the Amistad. You may be familiar with this thanks to Steven Spielberg, pop culture. That's how Americans learn their history, because this was later turned into a movie directed by Steven Spielberg. In 1839, the Amistad event occurred, and you had the slave rebellion aboard a Spanish ship. They slaughtered the crew to control the ship and sailed it as far north as Long Island, New York. The ship was intercepted in American waters, and that meant that ultimately the fate of this crew was adjudicated in American courts, and the slaves who led the slave rebellion aboard the Amistad were later granted their freedom, and they never were enslaved again. They were returned to Africa, and that was often represented in minstrel shows, again in a way that represented these African Americans in a sympathetic light. So minstrels are complicated, because pop culture is complicated and controversial. But hopefully the survey of minstrel shows here, again, helps to situate it within some of the contours of antebellum America that we talked about, urbanization, industrialization, but also speaks to, again, the lasting influence of this form of entertainment.